We've got handheld mics or stand-up mics on the center, either corner there. So when we get to Q&A session, please use a mic as we're taping this as we go along. And I'll just go ahead and get going right in with the program right now. And we have a big day here, our second day at TechNet Cyber. This is our second micro keynote pairing on the topic of robotic process automation. And the presentations this morning are Stephen Wallace from DISA and Jason Prow from IBM. And I want to thank them for joining us this morning. To be sure that we're not to take up too much time from the podium, the bios are on the website. If you have the app, that's an easy way to check it out. And we're going to start this morning, and they're going to introduce themselves as they go along, but I think we'll start this morning with Steve Wallace, who's the Chief Technology Officer at DISA. He also served at DISA's Emerging Technology Directorate. His focus is on delivering innovative processes and services across DISA. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
It's all yours.
Thank you. All right. Morning, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone socially distant in the seats and that we were able to provide a venue to do that. Clearly, everyone is, there's a lot of other interesting topics right now, but we will do our best to entertain and answer all of your questions over the next 45 minutes, I believe. So I'm Steve Wallace, as was mentioned. I'm part of the Emerging Technology Directorate at DISA, so we get to work on all kinds of different challenges, problems, that kind of thing. Today we're going to talk to you about some of the things that we're doing around robotic process automation within the agency. We've really started down the path of RPA about a little under a year ago, just seeing the need and then trying to engage and get going. So with that, Jason?
Yep, thank you. Yep, Jason Pro with IBM. I've been with IBM for 15 years now. I currently serve as the Automation and Data Platforms Leader for IBM Federal. I've been working in the robotic process automation space since around 2018. And I've had the pleasure of being able to design and deploy an automation platform that has around 300 unattended automations that are servicing the federal government today. So excited to be here with Steve. I think in terms of the agenda of what we'll go through today, Steve's going to give a little bit of an overview about what robotic process automation is, talk about the program that's being initiated at DISA, some of the challenges and takeaways that they've had today. And then we'll have a little bit of a dialogue around the content that's presented. And then finally, I'll end it with a little bit of discussion or conversation around what I see as critical success factors to deploying automation at scale. So with that, Steve.
All right, thanks. Ooh, it was hot. Okay, so next slide, please. Oh, disclaimer, you've all seen this a couple times by now. Next slide, please. Okay, so the overview of what we're doing. I mentioned we started down this pathway a little less than a year ago. Really, for us, constantly for a while we got asked the question, what are you doing about AI and ML? What's going on with AI and ML in the agency? And while we do have some AI and ML efforts, the reality is that RPA for us is sort of, and I've heard it described as the gateway to AI and ML, to doing a bit more of that. But for us, it's also the gateway to getting rid of some of the menial tasks and some of the repetitive tasks. You know, we've all seen the Simpsons and Homer sitting behind the desk pressing the same button again and again and again and again. Most of us didn't get into our field of work to press the same button again and again and again and again. But you know who did? The computers, and they're really good at doing that. So the benefit of the bots is it's obviously a time save, right? We are very much early on, and Jason talked about unattended bots. We are still in the attended bots phase. DISA actually started, well, my team got involved around a year ago, less than a year ago, like I mentioned. DISA's actually been dabbling in RPA on the financial side of things for about the last 3 years. Again, still using attended bots, but they found a dramatic increase in their throughput when they started leveraging the attended bots. Even though somebody had to be sitting there with them, it's a matter of consistency and accuracy in the work that's done. They were able to take a number of the financial reports and just in a very consistent and repetitive way, come out with the results that they needed. Oh, there we go. So next slide, please. So talking about, value and implementation, there's a number of things that we can do with the bots as we're moving forward. I've mentioned what the financial systems are doing. I saw Mr. Packard here. We're working with his team on the PLD side, on the procurement side of the house, where we are taking systems. I've seen some demonstrations of some of the work that folks have to do that people have for years, diving back and forth between systems, to having to compare numbers, extract data, compare that data that they've extracted, and then have to, actually produce a product from that. We're in the process right now with our team of developing a number of bots. I think we're just shy of a half dozen bots with them, not deployed, but still many of them in development, where the bot is jumping back and forth between interfaces and different applications, and it's showing us a lot of promise in terms of what we can do there. Another one is we're working with our public affairs office to take, every day they produce what they call DISA in the News email that goes out for all mentions of DISA out there, whether it be social or across the web. And that takes, from a person hours perspective, it's approximately a 2-hour task every day that someone is doing. So we're working with them on a bot to narrow that down. We think we can get it down to somewhere in the order of 30 seconds to bring the data down, correlate the data, and then produce the email that ultimately goes out. So we're going back and forth and working with some of that now. There's a lot of other promise that we see here too. One of the ones that I'm really interested in, but we haven't started to tackle yet because I think it's a little bit more advanced than where we are at the moment. But the director talked yesterday about the need to be more quickly making risk decisions and the way that we move packages through the risk assessment process. RPA is a really good tool, in my opinion, for something like that. So, when we've all lived it, we submit these packages that, reams of data, reams of, documents that talk about the state of our systems, how it's configured, all that kind of thing. We build it to a specific template. We try to pack it with as much information as we can, and then the program hands it off to the authorizing official's office, and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say, okay, well, you've met this criteria, this criteria, this criteria, you're weak here, what have you. That's a great task for a bot to dig through that document, look for common ways that perhaps folks might have taken the easy way out, or maybe they didn't provide enough information, or what have you, or there's additional questions. That's a really good tier 0 sort of approach for a bot to go and take that document and then turn it back around and kick it back to the program nearly immediately and say, hey, I need more information on this, or pass it along and say, okay, it's met the minimum threshold, go ahead, move it on, and continue to act on it. It benefits both the program because they get a more immediate response, and then it also benefits the AO's office because you're not spending time in that initial triage of the document. So that's one of the more advanced cases that we're looking for, and I think that we'll get there in hopefully the next few months as we get better. Our approach thus far has been purely in-house, but we're on the verge of starting to work with industry to pull in some talent from industry to help us move a little bit more quickly. Our goal was, within EM, was to sort of build that knowledge base and start to build a program, a sort of gun-for-hire program, if you will, where if there's a need in the agency, we are able to try to satisfy that need, and then we build and build, and it effectively snowballs as we build talent within the agency to help us do this. Bringing in help from industry will only make that stronger. So next slide. So let's talk about the challenges that we're seeing just so far. And Jason and I are going to talk a little bit more about this kind of as we go, because he's got a tremendous amount of experience in this space. But oftentimes, and that's not just specific to RPA, we've seen it in other automation efforts that we've done, that if we try to take the legacy business processes and align them against and automate them, it doesn't always go very well. You oftentimes have to look at the legacy processes, evolve those at the same time that you're trying to automate if we're trying to get an effective outcome here. So I mentioned the the staffing and the financial requirements, but the staffing specifically, we took some of our folks in EM that weren't necessarily developers, and this is actually, I think, a testament to some of the ease that we've seen out of the platforms. They're not traditional developers, and they've started to develop these bots. So it's maybe gone a little bit slower than what we had hoped, but it's really interesting to see how easy some of these platforms are and some of the easier bots to develop. So some of the things that we've seen too is, as we've sat down with process owners, we'll walk through the entire process and what we need the bot to do, but oftentimes we don't fully account for an error that the system might pop out, or a difference in the way it might operate from one day to the next day, or difference that you get with one set of inputs versus another set. So that's one of the other areas that we're trying to account for all those possibilities and all those variables. We're learning is a bit of a challenge and something that we're looking to tackle. So with that, I think next slide. Yeah, this is the last slide that we have. So so right now we're prioritizing getting the staff trained, bringing in some folks from industry to help us move this thing along more quickly. It's one of these crawl, walk, run deals, right? So we are I would say we are crawling at this point. We are quickly moving to a walk phase where we will get better. And like I mentioned, it's sort of a snowball effect where it's getting out of the gate initially, but then building the speed and building the velocity so that we can deliver these bots more quickly. So that the other side is too is right now we've only got we're working. I mentioned with Mr. Packard's organization. We're working with our PAO folks and the financial folks. We've got a lot of interest elsewhere in the agency as well. On our operations side, I know there's portions from the network management perspective where we're starting to employ some RPA over there. From the infrastructure, the compute side of things, that team is very interested in getting involved, and I think we've at this point given them some licenses and they've taken some of the training, so it's growing. We're trying to still, I wouldn't say contain it because that would imply that we're slowing it down. We're really trying to manage expectations and also make sure that the agency does it in a cohesive way. That's the better way of putting it. So what we don't want to do is have the agency pop up in so many spots and we become deeply disjointed, and then we're all doing things differently. We're not sharing the code behind the bots, that kind of thing. That's critical to making sure that we can move faster because we won't be repeating the same tasks over and over again. So the more reuse that we can get, the better, and so we're working to build that community across the agency. So you'll see more of that as over this quarter as well as the following quarter. So with that, Jason?
Cool, thank you. Yes, I think right now just maybe to dig in a little bit deeper on some of the topics that were discussed here, maybe just talk and ask a couple questions around the experience. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had leading up to this around kind of where you're at in this, what I'll just call an evolution or journey of standing up the program, putting a little bit more structure around it to drive more automation effectiveness. But a couple of the topics that I thought were really intriguing and interesting to talk about was this idea around legacy processes, right? And do they lend themselves to automation? And I kind of view it in two different lights. One that could be purely manual, right, where there is no system interaction. So that's an interesting challenge. But then secondly, around re-engineering processes and the way that the process owners view that exercise of capturing requirements, but also re-engineering process. You talk a little bit about the experience and what you're observing when you're engaging those process owners around kind of the improvement or re-engineering for automation.
Sure. So so we see across the spectrum, right? The few organizations that I mentioned that we've been working with so far are not your traditionally technically driven organizations. They do a variety of other tasks within the agency, and so we have to approach some of that process re-engineering or process looking with that in mind. So that's one of the keys kind of going in, and early on when we started down the path, the team would just sit down with the folks on the other side and say, hey, describe, what it is that you're doing. And then the folks that were having, the process owners would look back and say, well, tell me how you're going to do it. And it almost resulted in a stalemate of, hey, I'm waiting for you to blink and you're waiting for me to blink. So what we found pretty quickly, and I give a credit one of the engineers on our team, is they would actually sit down in a team session, in a Microsoft Teams session, and they'd bring it up. And even if they were in the same room, they'd bring up the team session, and they would use screen sharing, and they'd say, okay, we're going to walk through how you interact with the system. And oh, by the way, we're going to record it so that we can then go back and replay it and understand exactly how you're interacting with the system. And it doesn't just happen once. It may happen a couple times, go from different angles, maybe use different users. But we started there, and what we've also seen is an acceptance from the process owners that, hey, we probably need to tweak this, we need to evolve that. They're realizing they need to look at things potentially a little differently as well.
Yeah, that's awesome, and you really touched on what we see as a best practice, right, around kind of recording that interaction such that you have the real life kind of requirements as to what's happening today. One of the challenges that we always run into when looking at re-engineering a process is, as you deploy more and more automation, you run into situations where the bot or the automation itself isn't actually doing the process steps exactly the way the human was, right? And so when you look at the adoption, and it's just the way that automation works, sometimes it's interacting with back-end systems or APIs or whatever it might be, and they say, well, I'm not seeing the interaction on the screen. Right, so it takes a little bit of time to convince them, show them that the process is actually producing the output that is required, but it's not doing it necessarily in the exact kind of form and fashion that a human was. So it's always a little bit of an interesting conversation and experience as you're walking through that, and they say, well, I can't see that, and I say, well, look at the output that's being generated.
Right.
So. The other part of that, and you're alluding to it here, right, is the capturing of the requirements themselves, right, and engaging with those process owners on, what should the automation do, when is it done, what are some of the exceptions. You talk a little bit about the experience and how you all are capturing requirements and how that's evolved over, the time that you've been involved.
Sure. So, like I mentioned, that we started out in sort of that, looking at one another across the table or virtually across the table, trying to figure out how we wanted to capture that. And it's part of it too has been through demonstration. So we've also sat down with some of the teams and demonstrated, look, this is how the product actually works and how it interacts. And I think then it starts to get them thinking, oh, okay, well, then I need to work with you on how we do this and that sort of thing. So. We've made some strides there, and definitely, and we're continuing to evolve that, that methodology itself, and get better. I think every time that we get through it.
Yeah, I think kind of went through the same evolution, right? Of capturing kind of requirements in real time, via recording, right? Having both the functionals as well as the developers working together to say, is this what it should be doing, right? And then we kind of got to a point where it was, we need a little bit more structure and documentation, right, around what the process is, what the automation should be, what it should be doing, when is it done. And we went down the path, right, of producing, you'll hear the term process design documents and system design documents, all which are very well intended, but then we get down the process of producing more documentation, right, another Word document. And we have a little saying internal to IBM where it's, don't forget the process and process automation, right? I mean, you're automating a process. And so we've really evolved our thinking over time, which is we capture all of our requirements in a process model itself, along with the data, the transformations that need to occur, as well as the underlying information flow that needs to occur. Right, and that serves as the technical blueprint for our developers, right? So we capture the process with the functionals, we capture all the relevant inputs, outputs, and policies, procedures, and then we turn that into a technical design model, which then our developers work and work through. but it is an evolution, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the process of capturing and documentation is great for the thought process, right? In order to capture the various elements that you want to occur within the automation. I think putting it in the logical flow or the model, really helped everybody generate a shared perspective on what needs to happen. It also provided a nice blueprint for saying what's done and what's not, right? So that's good. One of the things that it kind of evolves out of that, or at least that we've seen, right, is when you're modeling the process, not every individual understands every exception that may or may not occur. One, there's functional exceptions. Two, there are what I'll just call more technical exceptions. The way something's interacting with the system, right? The way you may receive network latency. Who knows? There may be any sort of cleanup jobs happening on the network, right, that keep it from actually working. But with regard to the exceptions and handling, and you also touched on this as one of the challenges where you're seeing changes in process and data, which are then causing automations to break. Can you talk a little bit about what I'll just call more of like how the developers are handling those changes in the target systems today? Is it reactionary at the moment where something breaks and they go and fix it?
So I'd like to say that we had that one nailed down.
Yeah.
But that's one of the areas where we're going to have to continue to improve. So I'd say that it is very reactionary right now, right? So they are learning to better anticipate some of those things. You talked about network latency. I watched one of the demos that we were doing for one of the groups, and I watched the bot during, of course, during the demonstration phase, when we're demonstrating it to the folks that are going to be inheriting it. As we're demonstrating it to them, the bot is failing and it's not doing the things that it's supposed to do. Well, that particular day, the application that the bot was interacting with wasn't having its best day. So, so the bot was, struggling. It was missing some of its cues. It was, timing out on certain things. And so that's some of the places where we are learning to get better about, hey, we probably need to anticipate or perhaps look for elements on the screen versus timing, those kinds of things that we're getting better about. But I would say we are still right now quite reactionary in our approach.
Yeah, I think one of the elements that organizations tend to kind of overlook when they deploy automation is it's very much a user experience, a user satisfaction component to it, which is once the automation is deployed, the user community or those that benefit from the automation itself become they rely on that automation, right, to perform an element of their job. And when that doesn't happen, they get very frustrated.
Yes.
Right? When it breaks, they are very frustrated, right? So as part of the adoption and that is trying to get ahead of that more proactively monitoring. I think one of the best practices that we've seen is really embedding yourself into the configuration management process of both the source and target systems. Understanding when changes are going to be made such that you're making changes to the underlying automation so that proactively you're changing the code such that it can work when the changes are made in the system, right? But it's very much a coordination thing, right? Getting embedded into other parts of the organization, their processes, their procedures, requires a little bit of collaboration amongst the community, right? Such that you're staying ahead and keeping that kind of user satisfaction in place.
And that would be that. I think that's part of our longer-term goal as this thing grows to start to embed folks in the programs because you're right. It's not a fire and forget sort of thing. Those bots are constantly evolving, and we have to be ready for that.
And I'll touch on this in a little bit, but I mean, it is, as you said, it's not a fire and forget, right? The automations themselves require kind of continuous care and feeding, right? Just as you would with an employee. You have to continue to train. You have to evolve as processes change, as systems change. Such do the bots themselves or the automations themselves. Talking a little bit about kind of the people side of this, right? I know that you talked about training and that and maintaining the skill sets needed to not just design and build automations, but to operate and maintain them. Can you talk a little bit about how you're working towards the kind of human capital side of this to support your program?
Sure. So we started with just getting a couple of individuals. First I asked them to go and download at home and download some of the, from a few of the larger platforms, download the software, start playing around with it, get a little bit of an understanding of it, and then we're going to send you off to a class for a week or two to try to get you up to speed. Frankly, I would rather the civilian staff have a basis of knowledge and a basis of capability before we start bringing in the vendor community, so that we have the better ability to communicate and communicate our needs to the vendors and sort of work that interaction as we bring folks in to help us move it along. So we've at this point, I think, trained up from our team alone about 6 developers. And they're still fairly early on. That training really just happened within the last month. But then we're also getting other folks within the agency trained. As I mentioned, we're trying to grow within other spots within the agency, start to grow that talent specifically. So I think bringing in folks from industry is really key to help us get this done. DISA is not traditionally a development organization. We're more of an infrastructure organization, although we have many folks who can do development. And those are the ones that we're bringing into some of this and help trying to integrate them into this process.
Yeah, one of the decisions that I think will have to be made as you kind of evolve over time, right, is do you inherently own those developers, or is that something more that you leverage from what was called the process owners, right, or the other elements of the organization? Where is your thought process? Are you trying to provide a center of gravity with the developer community, or?
So I think I know we are starting with that center of gravity within the Emerging Technology Director, but our goal all along has been, let's start to build it, let's build a community of practice within the agency, let's move it out of EM and into a more permanent organization within the agency after we've sort of fostered it, but then to build those folks across the agency who have that. So so that it isn't necessarily the center of the universe, although it may be the sort of matrix or something of that nature. But to your point earlier, you need to have the folks embedded. Otherwise, it's it's Groundhog Day every time, where you're trying to show up and learn the organizations or the team's processes. It's much better if they're involved and they have a background in RPA, and they don't have to be the most senior of developers. We can centralize some of that functionality, but then have the general class of developers out there, building those RPAs.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Maybe transitioning a bit into kind of some of the next steps that you outlined there was a focus on developing or working towards a number of proof of concepts, which I think are incredibly important for both kind of the user community or those that are the beneficiary of the automation itself, but also for the development community and those that are going to have to operate and maintain it. Right? It really kind of serves as a first step to getting familiar with the technology. One of the challenges that we've seen, right, is what I will refer to as prototyping without the intent of bringing to production. Right? Because there are different steps that need to occur in order for that proof of concept to be turned into an actual production capability. So I'm just curious a little bit about how you all are viewing kind of proof of concepts. Is the intent to really just get familiar with the technology, or is it really prototyping or developing a proof of concept with the intent of bringing it into production?
So the work that we're doing right now is to bring it in with the intent of going into production.
Yep.
When we asked them to from home do some of the working with some of the trial licenses from some of the vendors, that was that early getting to know you sort of phase.
Yep.
But we are definitely now moving into the realm of delivering a product that ultimately goes into production. Again, we are starting off slowly and picking up speed as we go.
Yeah.
But that is our intent. Is the stuff that we're working on now ultimately goes into production.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, I think you're also you'd mentioned that a lot of the automations that you have deployed today are of the attended fashion.
Yes.
That's also a great enabler, right, of allowing the community to get familiar about how this is going to run, in production while it's attended, right, by a human, whether that's monitoring or monitoring the output. I think as you get into moving towards the more unattended, that progression, right, or promotion into production requires a little bit more, let me just say, oversight and governance around how that's going to be promoted, and what's the expectation as you get there.
Yeah. I mean, the unattended bots is probably one of our next big hurdles that we're going to have to work through, and that's the ultimate goal, right? The goal is not to have somebody sit there and babysit the bot, 24/7. It does help us from the perspective of consistency and that type of thing, but having an attended bot, that's sort of the the wading in, if you will, to the pool. We need to jump into the deep end reasonably quickly and get to the unattended. The challenges behind unattended for us is the identity and the ensuring that the bot is contained and doesn't have the ability to go in different directions that are unintended from the original intent that we're trying to set forth with. So Jason, I know you have a lot of experience with the unattended side, so we've been talking a bit about that. That's that's where we're ultimately trying to get.
I was going to try to avoid the conversation around the challenges of deploying unattended bots in defense. I know the identity element has been an ongoing conversation, not just within OSD, DISA, but across defense at large. I think there's some significant progress that's being made around how do you assign an identity, how do you pass certificates, how do you manage certificates for the unattended community. But that's probably a whole nother session that we could talk about. Maybe touch on one more point, and then I'll get into what I've seen as some of the critical success factors. You talked a lot about exploring kind of the operational benefit and the financial benefit of robotic process automation. I'm just curious a little bit about your thought process and what some of the financial benefits could be. I know it's a little bit hard in the federal government, right, to really kind of target financial benefits, but there are in different ways of looking at it. I'll be interested to hear how you all kind of view the financial benefits of RPA.
So there's a couple of ways that we're seeing that one. So from the perspective that, and this is where people start to get a little leery when we start talking about automation. In general, right? Oftentimes the reaction is, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job.
Yep.
The bot is going to come and take my job, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is the workload is only growing, and it's not growing at a static rate, it's growing at an exponential rate. And so that ability to automate, again, the menial tasks or the more consistent tasks that the user has, it removes that from their plate. And that's what our financial folks saw. They were able to accomplish their goals more quickly with similar staff just by employing these automations. So, financially speaking, you don't necessarily have to attempt to grow the workforce at the same rate. But I also want to be abundantly clear that it also doesn't mean that people have to go away. That we really our mission, especially at DISA, our mission is continuing to evolve. I've been at the agency for 10 years, and I've watched that agency grow and evolve, and new things come on, and we're operating vastly differently than we were 10 years ago. So that ability for us to adapt, I think the automations and the bots are key to that, and maintaining costs as our mission grows and adapts is a huge component of that. On the operations side of things, same thing, right? And it's just, again, like any other automation, is that there are more complex problems to solve that we can use our workforce to go and solve, rather than some of the repetitive tasks that we can leverage RPA for. So,
yep.
I think that's our best bet going forward.
That's great. And first of all, I applaud you for keeping the improvement element front of mind. I wouldn't say a lot of time, but I've certainly been in scenarios where our clients have been focused on RPA for the sake of RPA, right? Which is a little bit of missing the point, right? It's around driving improvements to the organization, the process, the mission, right? And it can have a financial impact. You touched on two really critical points that I just want to provide a little bit more insight on, right? So one is we have absolutely 100% seen when deployed effectively, RPA provides the workforce time back to do the things that they can't get to on a day-to-day basis, right? That they spend on doing a lot of things that, you know, they're not necessarily using their mind or their thought process to perform, right? A lot of the menial tasks that we talk to. So when people talk about, oh, are we going to lose my job? And I ask everyone, I say, well, how many things that are on your plate that you would like to do today that you're not doing because you're having to do something else? Right? And every time the answer is, well, if I had the time to do it, I would do X, Y, and Z. All right, so almost 100% of the time, that's the reality of what happens when the automation is deployed. Secondly, and I apologize to any of my industry partners out here, there can be a real financial incentive in deploying automation and actually realizing cost savings, right? If you look at any operational budget of a federal government or a federal entity, right, within the government, there's always a line item for administrative services, right? And that line item is typically staffed by people that are from industry, right? We have seen significant cost takeout when deploying automation in support of administrative services. Think about invoice processing, closing out of invoicing, contract management, you know, things that are contracted out to industry partners, right, where automation is hands down a cheaper way of performing that work. So people say, oh, well, you can't realize cost savings in the federal government. You absolutely can on that. So I'm gonna transition just a little bit and talk about some of the experience that we've had for, I don't know, probably the next 7-8 minutes, and then we can open up to questions. But the experience in effectively scaling automation programs. As mentioned before, you know, IBM, we decided, you know, back in around 2018, early 2019, that automation was going to be a game changer in the federal government, right? And we looked at some of the challenges or barriers to success. A lot of it around talent, a lot of it around the security and accreditation of technology platforms, a lot of it around the technology that was required and the architecture that was required to be successful. So we went down the path of actually establishing our own automation platform that we deliver as a service to the federal government. I only bring that up because we've had to go through the same evolution that you're going through here, which is we've had to establish the processes and procedures to identify what we're going to automate, how we're going to engage with clients, how we're going to capture requirements, how we're going to adhere to service level agreements, all of the things that are required to deploy this into production, right? The second thing that we had to do was we also had to design a platform, you know, that would be able to scale, right? And then finally we had to operate and maintain that, right? So once again, I highlight that because we've kind of gone through that evolution, and it has been an evolution, right? We started in 2019, and by no means were we capable of doing what we're capable of doing today. But when I look at it, there's really four core elements, right, to effectively scaling automation. You know, the first is around what I'll just call operating model. There's a lot of conversation around center of excellence, which is a great concept, meaning it talks about all of the elements of a automation program that need to be in place in order to effectively scale. Center of excellence, a very good concept. Where it comes to reality is in the operating model that allows all of those elements to effectively work together, right? It's a program. It's a management structure. It's something that is required in order to effectively achieve the outcome that you're seeking, right? And the core to all of it is, one, having all of those elements defined, right, to the right level of detail. But the second is the people, right? The collaboration that's required for an organization to come together to do everything from managing the environment, provisioning the environment, securing the environment, updating the environment, to deploying updates to the software, to building the applications, to measuring the benefits, the outcomes. It's a program, right? And a real critical success factor is how do all of the people work together within that program to effectively achieve the outcome, right? So while I, you know, absolutely adhere to center of excellence concepts and the frameworks that are there, don't forget about the people component to this and the collaboration that's required to work together. So that's element number one. The second is, and I won't get into a ton of detail, but around the technology platform itself. We talked about Attended. Like I said, it's a very good enabler to getting comfortable with the technology and with the processes that are being automated. But really where you see the benefits is when you start to consolidate the management of that technology platform, right? And you start to see the reuse or the reusability of the code or the objects that are being deployed. And the way to do that is through consolidation and using a single technology platform that's managed by a single organization, right? Or an element of the organization that you intend to influence. So one is the consolidation of the platform itself, but I think as you'll see when you evolve is RPA is only going to be one element of the automated solution. You're going to start to see that RPA will have inherent challenges in dealing with certain types of processes, right? So you'll have to start to embed other technologies into that, such as optimal character recognition, a little bit of AI for the purpose of improving data quality, right, and determining what action needs to be taken next. Right, so as you get a little bit more mature in the processes that are being automated, it requires additional technologies outside of just pure RPA, and I think a lot of the RPA vendors that started there are also making that evolution to make it into a single technology platform, making it easier for all of us to use. So the management of the technology platform, making it available, consolidated the management of it, and then also embedding additional components to help you automate end to end. This goes to the third element of it, which is it requires what we've seen in terms of the greatest outcomes that are generated is when you're designing around a framework, right, to infuse as much automation into an end-to-end process, said differently, to solve a problem, right? And being able to iterate along that end-to-end process or that problem, right, to drive as much automation into that problem is where you have the greatest results. Sometimes I see in organizations where there's a lot of RPA that's going on across multiple functions with no real framework or consideration for how it's working within the operational environment. And effectively what's happening is processes are being sub-optimized. Right? You have certain automations that are working against other automations. You're pushing the problem to another part of the organization. Right? So having that framework in mind, right, to understand how are you driving improvement across an end-to-end process or to solve a problem is critical. So the last thing I'll talk about here, and it's something that I think is overlooked at times, is the importance of monitoring the performance of automation and leveraging the data that's being created by the automation, right? I started back in the process re-engineering, Lean Six Sigma days. Then we moved into like business process management. And we always had this idea, right, and it was true, right, is as you move into automation, you're driving greater standardization. And, you know, as a Lean Six Sigma nerd, what happens is you have the data that's required to actually improve performance. You can actually monitor what's happening. You can actually put controls in place. You can monitor the performance. RPA creates an enormous amount of data, right? Every interaction that's occurring, there's data that's being created, which is now giving you the ability, right, to monitor the performance, but also assess how is a process or an operation actually performing against the desired outcome, right? And allows you to actually monitor and make changes to it. So I think monitoring the performance is critical for being successful, improving the performance. But one element that I know we didn't think about until we got into really transactionally oriented automations was this concept of validation and verification. When you're deploying automation at scale, there's a lot of activity that's occurring, right? I encourage anyone to go watch 10 to 15 bots run at a single time on your monitor. You'll quickly become very dizzy, right? Because there's just a lot of activity that's occurring, right? And when you have that much activity that's occurring at the rate that it's occurring, you want to make sure that the actions that are intended are the actions that are actually being taken. I won't go into the specifics of an example, but we deploy over a couple hundred bots in support of a process within the federal government, all unattended. We have a requirement in SLA, right, to have certain quality standards. So we put a sampling methodology in place on the back end that views all of the actions that are being taken to ensure that the intended action is the actual action. there have been 3 times over the course of 15 months where we've ran into a situation where the intended action wasn't actually the action that was being taken, meaning we were interacting with a source system. We were intending to deal with somebody's personal information. The way the interaction was occurring, the bot was interacting with the system too quickly, and what it was happening was it was picking up the individual's information from the previous transaction. So it was picking up somebody else's social security number, phone numbers, addresses, and was taking that information and was using that to update a target system on the back end, right? And without having kind of that validation and verification method in place, we would have let that run for a year and we would have been in big trouble, right? But the ability to identify when mistakes are occurring, because it is technology, it is an interface, right? It is going to be working rapidly, and there are many things that could impose that. You want to make sure that you're monitoring that such that you can take corrective action. It is a very real challenge, and it is a very real situation that occurs when you're deploying a lot of these things at scale. So those are the 4 what I call critical success factors: the operating model, right, the technology platform and the management of that, the end-to-end process framework to drive improvements across an end-to-end process, and finally, right, the performance monitoring and the verification and validation. All things that are very critical when deploying at scale. So I don't know how much time we have left.
I think we're a little over, actually.
All right. Good.
We were worried about filling up 45 minutes.
We did it.
That wasn't too hard. So thank you all. Appreciate you all sticking around, and thanks for coming out this morning. And thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Steve.
Before you go away, let me just make a couple comments. What you just saw this last 45 minutes, what I think is a perfect relationship between government and industry. The trust and the coordination and the communication that's required for a successful program like the RPA program that they talked about this morning. But honestly, I think this whole conference actually relates to this. And you can go to any one of these booths out here to talk to any one of these vendors that are here, and you can build on this relationship as you attend here today, yesterday, and tomorrow. There'll be an outreach of DISA to industry, which is also important. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. I wish we had more people here today. But let me just make a couple other comments. At 9:30, Lieutenant General John Marston is going to be the speaker in the keynote area. At 10:15, back here, there's going to be a JADC2 session. It'll be actually a follow-up because at 8:30 this morning or 8:15 this morning, there was an industry perspective from DISA on JADC2. You'll get 2 of the principals here at 10:15. So if you're interested in that, we'll see you back here at 10:15. If you want to go to the keynote, start moving, make your head calls, get some coffee, enjoy the rest of your day here today. Thank you.
Thanks. That's awesome. Appreciate it.